Kang Dae-hoo becomes unemployed after suffering an accident in the army. Things seemed bad because he had to move back in with his mother in a small house. But he soon discovers that the accident gave him the ability to foresee the future. His first thought is to use this power to his advantage, and with it, he manages to save a good amount of money. Then, the protagonist uses all he has to invest in some companies that he knows will be successful. His money starts to triple, and he grows, confident in becoming the world's #1 investor. The story begins in an ordinary city in Korea. A reporter from a local newspaper interviews some people passing by, asking what they would do if they suddenly came into 100 million won. The first woman responds that she would try to buy a house. The skeptical man says he would buy a car. The second girl says she would make an investment. The reporter then decides to ask the final question, asking what would be the first thing they would do if they were the richest person in the world. Obviously, the answer is that they would do nothing for the rest of their lives. At that moment, the opinions are analyzed by the journalist presenting the news live. She says those are good answers and compliments the guy in front of her. The woman introduces him as the youngest Korean to become the richest man in the world. She then asks him what his secret is. But before, the journalist also mentions rumors that he can see the future. As we can see, this guy is our protagonist, Ken Jin-roo. He denies that he can see the future. Suddenly, his eye glows with a yellow light, and he notices an old woman near the camera operator. At that moment, a massive golden eagle flies into the room, leaving behind some words wrapped in smoke. Kang is a bit paralyzed. The presenter calls him back to reality. The protagonist regains focus and replies that he became rich because he's a lucky investor. Suddenly, the boy opens his eyes, startled. Kang realizes that all of it was just a dream. What the boy doesn't understand is why that eagle he saw in the army keeps appearing in all his dreams, ruining them. At this moment, Kang looks around, realizing he is still poor and unemployed, praying with his mother. The boy glances at a picture frame with a family photo and remembers that he once had good times. Back then, his father was alive and had good businesses to support the family. Now he lives alone with his mother and accepts any part-time job to help her. Suddenly, the protagonist is pulled from his thoughts by a phone call. A little later, Kang arrives at his friend's house named Taek. The first thing the protagonist notices is that the guy still has his collection of girls. He says that Taek really hasn't changed. His friend disagrees, saying that now he has a much more colorful collection. Kang replies that it's impossible to know since the guy has had these things since high school. Taek asks how life is going. The protagonist tells him that he recently became unemployed but is confident that things might change since he has a prestigious university degree. So he thinks maybe he can give private lessons and make things a bit easier for his mother. The two toast with soda cans, and the protagonist also decides to thank his friend for spending time with his mother last Christmas. Taek replies that there was no problem at all, as he also considers Kang's mother to be his own. The friend then asks how his time in the army was, but Kay prefers not to talk about it. "Then I have something I really need to tell you," says Ta, with a serious tone that makes the protagonist ask what happened. At that moment, the friend reveals he found the password to his Bitcoin account. Singh asks what that is, and Tadig questions if the guy really forgot. Bitcoin is the virtual currency he earned from selling his character in the game LN. The protagonist finally remembers and recalls how, back then, the currency had risen to 50 million won, and Taek even cried because he had lost the password and, obviously, all that money. Friend R says, "Thank God I managed to find it while cleaning my room." He then asks how much Kang thinks the currency is currently worth. The protagonist has no idea. Tae replies that as of yesterday, it was worth 1,121. Kay starts doing the math in his head, converting the value to dollars and then to won, the currency of his country. The guy is immediately shocked, realizing that even after fees, the friend has over 1 million won. Ta raises his finger and delivers an even more shocking news. He says that 1 million won is just for 1 BNT, which is the symbol for that currency. The protagonist seems confused, so the friend explains in more detail that 1 million won equates to just a single BNT coin. King pauses for a moment and recalculates all of Taek's coins. He's quickly surprised to realize that the friend has over 13 billion won. Taek says it took a while to believe it, but it's really true. Kang yells, asking the friend to donate at least 100 million to him, since it wouldn't make any difference in his wallet. "That's exactly the kind of thing I'd do if I found out my friend became a billionaire overnight," he says. Taek responds that he can't give a single cent because he put everything into the exchange platform, believing the money will keep going up based on his calculations. The protagonist calls him a stingy idiot, then says that if he'd known it would make so much money, he would have taken the game more seriously. Suddenly, A memory comes to mind. Kay recalls that back then, he gave one of his characters for Taik to sell. He then demands his share of the cash, as the friend kept the money from his character. While being shaken, Ta asks how much he thinks his share is. Kang pauses for a moment, considering how much he should receive, but suddenly, his attention is drawn to the window. When the protagonist looks, he sees the same eagle from his dreams. But now, in real life, the boy starts trembling, asking why this is happening again. The eagle begins to fly and invades the apartment, wrapped in a strong yellow light, radiating its power. As it passes, it leaves a few scattered words in the smoke, which eventually become clearer. At that moment, the protagonist deciphers what those messages are. Ta, noticing his friend is a bit lost, tries to bring him back to reality. King asks if he knows what the mountain's hill is. The friend replies yes. The mountain's hill is an exchange platform where his B-coin is stored. Look at the words left by the eagle where it states that the mountain hill will go bankrupt. He then worries about Taik and asks if the guy is sure that this platform is safe or if there's no danger of it going bankrupt. Taik doesn't understand the meaning of this sudden conversation and responds that he trusts the platform 100%. The protagonist feels as if he's going crazy. He even says that all of this is a hallucination. This eagle has been appearing since his time in the army and always leaves some messages. Anyway, the boy decides not to take any chances and shouts for Taik to take out all the money he has on the platform. The guy is obviously caught by surprise and questions why he's asking this so suddenly. Kang shouts as he grabs his friend and begs him to take the money out now. He asks the girl to take all the money out of the platform. Meanwhile, the protagonist realizes that the words left by the eagle have disappeared. In a way, he believes he's not hallucinating because he got the name of the platform right. Suddenly, his friend shouts that it's not possible and looks at his phone. He says that the platform Mountain Hill has just gone offline. It seems the server crashed. The good news is that his sister managed to get the money out in time. Hearing this makes Kang believe even more that he can predict the future. At this moment, Taik receives other news. It seems that the platform came back online, but this time, all client accounts are empty. People are commenting on the internet about the money disappearing from the platform without prior notice. Taik approaches Kang and asks him to please be honest, since he promised he would tell him everything if he took the money out of the platform. The protagonist thinks for a moment and decides to reveal the whole truth. He says he has the ability to predict the future. A few minutes later, the scene shifts to what happened a year ago when Kang was still in the army. It was there that he saw that eagle for the first time. It appeared when the soldiers were doing a common training exercise and testing some bombs. The protagonist caught the other men's attention and asked if they could see the size of that eagle, but the response wasn't very good. They said there was no eagle there, and then asked the protagonist to focus on the training. Kang looks where the animal passed and finds messages in the smoke saying that kilometer 1888 was going to explode. He looks to the side and sees the soldiers preparing the next test. The name and number match the messages. The protagonist realizes this, and his eyes fill with terror. The test was carried out, and the bomb exploded while still on the ground, injuring and eliminating several soldiers. The protagonist managed to throw himself to the ground in time and sustained only minor injuries. The scene returns to the present moment, and the friend is surprised to hear this whole story. He's happy that the protagonist survived. He recognizes he was very lucky, as most of the soldiers suffered fatal injuries. After this happened, the doctor said that the accident caused some confusion in his memory. Taik says that this response from the doctor is kind of vague, but in any case, the protagonist has already witnessed this phenomenon of seeing the future twice, and both times the information was true, so he doesn't think it's a coincidence. Ta says it sounds more like a superpower. Kang is surprised and thinks a bit about it after all. A superpower is something he only sees in movies. Also, he's impressed that his friend believed him right away. Taik responds that he'd believe it even if a cute anime character appeared in front of him. The protagonist says it's better to get to the main topic. He wants to know where his money is. His share is 1,200,000 W. Ta asks how he came up with this amount. The protagonist explains that at that time he sold his low-level character, so of the 11 billion that Taik received, his share is 1 billion, which represents about 99% of the 3 billion onan that Taik has now. The protagonist threatens to burn all those cute dolls if the guy doesn't hand over his share. Taik tells his friend to stop threatening him. Besides, there's no way to get the money right now. Quing responds that he understands, and that he must be planning to create a tax haven or something like that. Taik is surprised and asks how he knows. The protagonist asks if he forgot that he's an economics student. Taik says that his sister told him that if income tax is generated from Bitcoin, he will have to pay billions for it. So he created a tax haven in a place called Della Island, and his company is called OTK Corporation. The protagonist wonders if OTK stands for otaku. The guy shouts, saying it has nothing to do with that. In fact, it's an abbreviation of his first and last names, which in this case is Taik. Then, the boy celebrates, saying that once he retrieves the money, all that remains is to live a life of tranquility forever. The protagonist has a dumbfounded look and asks if he hasn't been doing that all along by trading in-game items. His friend is outraged and tries to refute this accusation, saying that it's not so easy to make money selling items. Kang accepts this response and just asks his friend to pay what he owes. Taik gives a reassuring smile and promises that he will pay as soon as he can transfer the money. The protagonist also gives the same smile. It was thanks to a prediction that the protagonist managed to receive an amount he never even thought he would have. The next day, he goes to a bank to withdraw the money transferred by his friend. Upon arriving there, the protagonist received a deposit of 500 million W. Taik reveals that he couldn't send all the money now, but would later find a way to get the remaining 740 million with his sister, as she is behind the release of the funds. He then asked the protagonist to be patient. Kang replied that it was no problem. At that moment, he stores the money he received from the bank, and the first thing he thinks of doing is helping his mother to stop working for a while and buying her new clothes. Then the boy enters the mall and sees a line of people gathered near the bathroom. Kang approaches, noticing that it's an argument. A female voice says she's going to file a complaint on the store's website, but first wants the woman to kneel and apologize. After all, she doesn't even know how much those shoes cost. The manager lowers his head and apologizes to the rich woman in front of him, then turns to the woman being humiliated and tells her to kneel now, just as the madam ordered. The protagonist's face turns incredulous when he realizes that the person being humiliated is his mother. At that moment, the blonde causing the scene orders her to kneel, or else she must pay for her shoes. The manager asks the protagonist's mother if she's going to obey or would prefer to be fired. Kang observes how his mother is dressed and remembers that she always said she worked at the call center of the department store. The lady knows she can't lose her job and starts to kneel, but before that happens, the protagonist pulls her by the arms. She looks back and sees her son. King questions what happened for the woman to demand that someone kneel. The mother turns her face away, embarrassed. The snobby blonde gets irritated and asks who he is to meddle in this matter. King responds that he is the son. The mother quickly interrupts and says she doesn't know the protagonist. Obviously, she doesn't want her son to be harmed as well. But the protagonist asks if she is ashamed of him, and then says that he is not ashamed at all of who his mother is. The snobby woman is surprised to discover that the boy is the son of the cleaning lady. The protagonist then asks again what happened. The blonde replies that his mother's mop ended up touching her shoe. The people watching the commotion look surprised at the blonde woman. Someone is even recording the situation. King can't believe that this is the reason she is using to humiliate his mother. The snobby woman gets irritated for not having her point taken seriously. She then asks if the boy knows how much her shoes cost. He says the price is 600,000 won. The protagonist can't stand this noise in his ear anymore and takes 600,000 won out of his pocket, then hands it to the woman. King demands that she apologize to his mother and leave with the money, or keep her precious shoes and walk away empty-handed. Suddenly, someone shouts that the woman is being filmed and suggests she should take the money. King asks if she prefers that he throw it on the floor. The snobby woman thinks for a moment and decides to accept the money. She says she's sorry, without much emotion, and turns to leave with the cash in hand. The protagonist then calls the manager and orders him to make sure to collect those shoes. The woman doesn't understand what he's talking about. King explains that he paid 600,000 for those shoes, so he'd better receive them by tomorrow, or he will report the store for theft. The manager quickly says he'll make sure everything is as he requested. King calls his mother to leave. The snobby woman says that the protagonist isn't even going to wear the shoes, so he's just being petty. King agrees that he won't wear them, and adds that he'll throw them in the trash tomorrow. Then he calls her an old lady and thanks her for reminding him. The woman shouts, irritated at being called old, and continues making a scene in the store. People watch, not understanding this show, while the protagonist and his mother are already outside the mall. The woman tells her son that if he goes back there, he can still fix everything, but King asks why she's allowing herself to be treated that way. He promises that it will never happen again and hugs her. The woman is still quite shaken by the humiliation she went through, but her son tells her that he will protect her. The mother gives a satisfied smile and says that he's really grown up. A little later, the two sit down for a meal at a popular restaurant. The protagonist has already told his mother everything about Benik. The woman was surprised that there is something that makes so much money. King says that she doesn't need to worry about paying for his college anymore, because now he has money. But the mother says that his college fund has been saved for a long time, so it's better for him to focus on going to college. The son responds that they can resolve this later. First, he wants to use the money to buy a new one there. King says he's sure his mother's coughs are due to that small house. The woman tries to say there's no need to worry, but the protagonist asks her to just accept what he's doing to improve her health. The mother then sighs and says he's just like his father. Suddenly, their conversation is interrupted by a call from Tyke. The protagonist answers, and the boy on the other end of the line starts shouting that an emergency has happened. He asks what happened. Tyke shouts that his sister is back in Korea. A few hours later, the scene shifts to the Nam's Chilon Hotel. Some strangers are pointing and laughing at something on the road, and at this moment we see the protagonist with his friend in a very funny car that was an otaku car. Kang can't hide that he's very embarrassed, but Taik seems very happy. After that, he enters the hotel, and Taik asks why the protagonist wanted to be dropped off on the street. This is a pretty obvious question for a boy. He says he didn't want to participate in his nerdy world. Suddenly, a voice catches their attention. The girl complains that they are 3 minutes late. This is Taik's sister. Her name is Ryun. Kang is surprised that the protagonist also came to pick her up. Kang affectionately addresses her as human, and they decide to sit together to chat a bit about the time they've spent apart. Someone asks how the time in the army was. Kang responds that he was discharged recently. She then suggests they work together at Golden Gate when he graduates. The protagonist says that if the company accepts, he will. H gets serious, and he asks what happened. She talks about the Mountain Hill platform, and asks her brother if he said the same. Taik responds yes, but he managed to withdraw all the money in time. The sister seems surprised and says she put everything into the company account, over $10 million. She sighs in relief and hands over a letter. She says these are the contact details for the manager of the Golden Gate branch in Gangnam, in case they need to transfer a large amount of money to a domestic account, that there is the contact of the person who can take care of it. H adds that Taik just has to mention he's her younger brother. Kang analyzes the information, then asks why Taik sold everything at once, since at first he said he would sell gradually. The brother couldn't reveal that the protagonist saw the future, so he replied he just felt like it. Kang asks if she came to see Taik, but Ryun denies it, saying she came to resolve a company matter and will be here for 10 days. Taik asks if she's really staying for 10 days. H gets annoyed and questions if he has any problem with it. Taik tries to answer no and asks where she'll be staying. The girl responds it's at this hotel. Taik is surprised because the place is very expensive. H says the whole team will be staying together. She's not worried because the company is paying. The protagonist remembers that just one night at the hotel costs 500,000 won, but he believes that's not a problem for a billionaire company. At that moment, Hoon receives a call and steps away a bit. Taik immediately asks Kang if he's intimidated by his sister's personality. The protagonist blames his friend for it. H returns and says the call was about the OPEC meeting schedule. Taik seems unsure what that is, but soon remembers that OPEC is an abbreviation for the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. The protagonist attentively observes the conversation and asks if they are a group of oil-producing countries. Hun confirms that it's exactly that. To be more precise, it's the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. The girl continues talking, saying that the results of the OPEC meeting will be announced the day after tomorrow. Suddenly, Kang's attention is drawn to a light. He again sees that eagle. She passes and leaves yet another prediction of the future. This time, the protagonist sees that OPEC will make a production cut agreement. Hun quickly calls him and asks if everything is okay. Kang apologizes and says he's just thinking a bit. He then is direct and asks Ryun about the chances of OPEC making a production cut. Ta is surprised by this question. Kang explains that the United States is indeed an oil-producing country, but the amount produced is still far from meeting internal demand. This means that even as an oil-producing country, it has maintained the position of the largest importer. However, recently, the United States began developing shale oil. The biggest disadvantage of this oil is that its production is quite expensive. The production cost is estimated at around $45 per barrel. So, if the price of oil drops below $50 per barrel, the forecast is that more than half of the companies relying on it will go bankrupt. Ryun drinks her tea calmly and says they are already aware of this matter, which is why OPEC member countries have hurriedly held several meetings to discuss production cuts. But the interests of oil-producing countries always ended in failure. so she thinks the meeting will not reach any agreement. The protagonist asks what will happen if they reach an agreement. R answers that the price of oil will skyrocket, and the market will be pleased, but the probability of that is extremely low. King asks if she believes or not that they will reach an agreement. R questions why he's insisting on this, and the protagonist realizes he's said too much and tries to change the situation by saying he was just overthinking. Ryan laughs and says that if an agreement is reached, it would be good. A little later, the protagonist returns home in Taek's nerdy car. He thinks a bit about the prediction he saw. If the OPEC production agreement really works out, the price of oil will skyrocket. Kang realizes that if he buys oil in advance, he can make a significant profit. The boy remembers that his previous predictions were correct, so this one might be too. The problem is how much money he can invest. Kang has just signed a lease contract, which should give him about 100 million in income from his mother, so the money he can use now is 275 million. But he still has 740 million in Taek's account. At this moment, the guy asks the protagonist if it happened again. Kang replies that he really has a sharp perception. His friend laughs, saying he's curious to know what he saw. The protagonist quickly has an idea and realizes he forgot to talk to Taek about his strategy. After a few minutes, Taek observes the plan carefully. He asks if the goal now is to buy in advance so that when oil prices rise, they can make a good profit. K confirms that's exactly what he was already thinking. T seems a bit confused and asks how they're going to stack up all the barrels of oil. The protagonist slaps him on the head and tells the guy to pay attention to traffic. A little later that day, they gather in front of the computer. Kang says that, according to Ryun, the WIM company can sustain itself around $60 per barrel. Ta is shocked by this information. He even heard what his sister said but couldn't understand any of it. The protagonist then decides to explain in detail to his friend. He says that crude oil is not only used to fuel cars, but is also used in various sectors like the industry. This means that an increase in oil prices has a significant impact on producer prices. TA understands and says he will send him 500 million W, leaving $11 million in his account, about 673,000 of King's. After passing all the information, he says he's ready to buy. The protagonist instructs to buy on the New York Mercantile Exchange. He says he'll invest 3,300,000 for now. Ta responds that he will also buy. King asks how much, and the guy responds 10 million. He's surprised by the high amount and asks if it's 10 million won, but Ta says it's $10 million. King asks if he's crazy for buying that much. His friend lowers the amount and asks if 5 million is okay. The protagonist seems a little uncomfortable, so his friend recalls the prediction. Kang responds that it seems Taek believes in the prediction much more than he does himself. The friend makes the last move and says he's going to buy 3 million. He states he won't buy less than that. Kang finally agrees. He thinks again about the prediction and says that if he's wrong, he'll accept the loss and then sell his part. His only worry is ruining Taek's 3 million, but he knows his friend won't give up on that amount, so he has no other choice. Without a second thought, the protagonist grabs his cell phone and buys the stocks. It was so quick that Taek couldn't even follow it with his eyes. He asks if everything went well, and Kang affirms. The friend then asks what will happen from now on, and the protagonist says they just need to watch for the OPEC meeting to end the next day. The protagonist moved with his mother to the new house the following day. He signed a rental contract for about 120 million won. The house is a bit old, but everything is clean, and the floors were recently replaced. His mother says she loves the house. It has 2 bedrooms, and sunlight comes in well. Kang is happy to hear this. He believes he could have bought a better place if he hadn't invested in the prediction. Anyway, it's great that his mother liked it. Suddenly, the protagonist notices the woman hesitating to touch one of the boxes. He remembers that when his father passed away, his mother donated some of his belongings, but there was something she would never have the courage to throw away, the photos of his father. At that moment, the woman looks at one of the frames where the family was gathered. Kang remembers that his mother's old dream was to have a house. His father managed to buy land and fulfilled that dream. That was their first home, where Kang was born and raised, so he understands that sometimes his mother can feel a bit sentimental. After all, most family memories were there. At that moment, Kang asks if she thinks of his father often. The mother replies that she does. She thinks if her husband hadn't worked so hard, he would still be alive today and could be moving with them. Kang observes the frame as the woman begins to cry. Later, she wipes her tears and says she still has a few things to grab, then tells her son to bring everything from his room. The protagonist agrees. After some time, Kang does an inventory and says there are many things they need to buy new, like a washing machine, a refrigerator, and a dining table. He approaches his mother and tells her she needs to take a break from work, but the woman disagrees and says she's perfectly healthy. The protagonist asks her to take at least 3 months off. His insistence convinces her. At this moment, Kang hands over an envelope and says he put about 100 million won in that account, so she can spend it however she likes. The woman is surprised by the amount of money, and the next moment she starts hitting the boy. She asks if he's been going around handing out money to just anyone. After the scolding, Kang replies that his mother isn't just anyone. The woman obviously worries about her son spending so much money on her, so she says she has her own savings. She suggests that he keep the money and use it to buy a house in the future, or even save it for his marriage. Kang insists that she accept it, or at least see it as if he's leaving it with her for now. The woman accepts and says he's as stubborn as his father. The protagonist remembers how much he still has in his private account and believes he won't need to do anything else for the next 20 years. Later that day, the doorbell rings, and Taek enters. The protagonist's mother goes toward him and asks how the boy is doing. As we can see, Taek's hands are quite full. He hands 2 bags of toilet paper rolls to the protagonist and asks him to consider it a gift for his new home. Kang looks at him incredulously and asks if he really had the nerve to give that as a gift when he has plenty of money in his wallet. Taek thinks his gift is good and asks what he should have brought. Then Kang smiles and says he would have accepted something simple like a refrigerator, a washing machine, or even a TV. Taek shouts to the woman that her son is trying to extort him. Minutes later, the two sit on the floor of the protagonist's empty room and eat some apples. Kang asks if he knows that the Mountain Hill has really gone bankrupt. Taek says it's all over the internet. Mountain Hill was the largest cryptocurrency exchange in the world, and damages are estimated between billions and up to 1 trillion won. Normally, the platform should compensate for the damages, but the amount, it exceeded expectations. In the end, the Mountain Hill preferred to declare bankruptcy. The protagonist soon asks what will happen to the people who were harmed. Ta says he believes it won't be possible to recover the B coins. This means that those who didn't withdraw the money in time ended up losing everything. If this bankruptcy had happened at a bank, the government probably would have reimbursed everyone. But Mountain Hill is a cryptocurrency platform, so it's almost impossible for the government to intervene. The friend comments that it's amazing the protagonist predicted the bankruptcy in time. King responds that it was just a coincidence. Tia gets serious and says that nothing in life happens by chance. King asks if he has any hunches, and the friend then starts shouting that he has a superpower that awakened in the moment of crisis. King shouts at him to keep it down and asks if he's gone mad. Ta claps his hands and says, "That's how superheroes are born." The protagonist is already lost in the conversation. T, who discovered his power, from now on will call him the Oracle Eye. Kang responds that he doesn't like that name and reminds them they need to worry about something really important, the OPEC meeting. Ta remains lost in his thoughts and says, "The Oracle Eye sounds really good." Rig asks if he's talking to himself. He says he might even consider the nickname if the prediction about the OPEC meeting is correct, but if it fails, it's worth remembering that they will lose money. T is confident in his prediction and makes it clear that he will call him the Oracle Eye if everything goes well. The protagonist sighs heavily. The next day, Kang goes to Taek's house and asks what his sister said about the meeting. As we can see, the friend is focused on the game with various foods around him. He responds that Ryun said she'll only know tomorrow. The protagonist gets anxious and thinks his prediction has failed. He starts to sweat, remembering that stock prices have dropped another 3%. He and Tak have already lost 100 million onan. Kang fears the worst might happen. His friend quickly reassures him, saying he trusts his prediction and invites him to play a game. In any case, they'll only get the answer tomorrow. Kang is happy with Taek's positive attitude and asks which game they will play. The boy replies that the name is dating. The protagonist picks up the console but can't get out of his head that if he keeps losing money, he'll end up bankrupt in the very near future. At this moment, the dating game presents 2 options for the player to choose from to respond to the character. The protagonist ends up selecting the option that he would rather go out, ask him what he's doing, and try to take the console back. Meanwhile, Kay keeps thinking that everything is going to go wrong and he'll end up poor, having to teach classes and never finishing university. The two keep trying to see who will grab the console until the protagonist shouts that the OPEC result is out. Tatig is startled by the information, while King grabs the phone and accesses the quick news site. The new information states that the countries reached a consensus for the first time. The second news reports that international oil prices rose after the decision to cut OPEC production. The protagonist realizes that things are happening as predicted. Now, for everything to go well, he needs to know how much UTI is selling, since that's where he bought the shares. Kang quickly accessed his account and was surprised by the price of a barrel of oil, It's costing $3, having risen over 20% in a few minutes. The protagonist immediately asks his friend to check his account. Ta grabs the phone, and Kay says that, for now, everything is going according to the forecast, but all he predicted was the production cut, not how much they'll receive. Ta lies down on the bed while accessing the account, and the protagonist becomes anxious, asking every moment how much they earned. Suddenly, the guy shouts that it yielded 630,000. He tries to convert it to Korean won. Tang is faster and says it's worth 700 million won. At the end of the day, see, Korean Tang is faster. He says this is worth 700 million won. By the end of the day, the protagonist needed to receive 740 million taik, but counting on the investment now, he will receive 800 million won. At this moment, his friend says he really should have invested $10 million. Kang responds that it's easy to say that when it's already successful, but Taik reminds him that he trusted his predictions from the beginning. His friend strikes a pose as he says there's no reason to be afraid anymore. There are already 3 correct predictions. This means his ability is real. King starts thinking about it and asks if he really sees him as that cartoon superhero. His friend confirms, saying that normally when people think of superpowers, they think of flying or destroying buildings with their fists. The difference is that such power can be replaced if you have a plane or an excavator. However, the power to predict the future is irreplaceable. Even now, with the advancement of computers and AI, it is still impossible to see the future. Taik believes the protagonist could do very well if he could predict disasters or even sports scores. The protagonist covers his eyes as energy emerges. He says he doesn't know exactly how it happened. Taik presumes it was in that accident in the army. Perhaps he awakened the power because of that. Els doesn't understand why the power only manifested now, and says if he had had that good vision back then, he would have run to a casino and gotten rich playing those games. But at the time of the accident, the prediction only appeared once and never again, so he thought it was an illusion in his mind. At that moment, Taik remembers something. He says that Kang's prediction came from when he told him about Bitcoin and the OPEC meeting, then suggests that the prediction is only related to finance. The protagonist responds that it's not a bad theory, but in that case, the explosion in the army is outside the pattern. His friend responds that probably that prediction was an exception because it posed a risk to his life. Suddenly, Taik seems to have an idea, and he desperately asks what happened after the explosion. The protagonist doesn't understand why this matters now. His friend quickly explains that if his prediction is only related to finance, then maybe that explosion wasn't accidental. Probably this case is related to corruption in military procurement. Taik rushes to the computer, saying there's a chance that the KM-1888 bomb was defective from the start. Kay says that maybe his friend isn't entirely wrong, but if he thinks about it, all man-made disasters are directly or indirectly related to finance. Taik immediately says he has a big idea. Kang responds that he's afraid when he says something like that, but decides to listen. Taik suggests they form a team. He will provide the money, and Kang will provide the superpower. Then they can invest together and later split the profits. The protagonist thinks it's a great idea but asks what will happen if they lose money in the process. Taik responds that they won't be able to do anything, just keep investing. Kang doesn't know if this kind of agreement is fair since his friend would bear all the losses alone. He then tells Taik he'd love to do it, but there's a big problem with this plan. He can't guarantee that what he sees is 100% accurate. If the prediction is wrong, they could lose millions. Kang continues talking while his friend can no longer bear listening. Same story. He's almost covering his ears. He says the boy needs to be more positive. After all, his 3 predictions were right. If they don't make use of this ability now, then they could indeed lose money. Taik then raises his hand in his direction and invites him to dive together into the world of investors. The protagonist looks at his friend with a silly face and asks what will happen if he doesn't accept. T says that the friendship would end. Kem says that seems a bit superficial. The guy keeps his hand raised and asks him to touch it. The protagonist feels pressured, but is soon saved by a call on his phone from someone named Mim. The boy answers, and the person on the other end invites him to have a drink in Hong, adding that Kung will also go. The protagonist sees this as an opportunity to escape and immediately agrees to meet his friends from college. Then he says goodbye to Taik, saying they'll continue this conversation later. The friend tries to stop him, but it's in vain. An hour passes, and the protagonist arrives at Kakoma's bar. He enters and soon sees his friends. Mi calls him Sergeant Kang, but he says he's already been discharged. Then he asks who all these people are. The senior replies that the girls are freshmen who joined the university this year. The one with black hair introduces herself as Huang Jie, the blonde, introduces herself as Shin Yuri. The protagonist greets both and then asks where Kei is. Pours a bit of drink and replies that Kung will be a little late. Kang starts drinking, and his friend asks if he's not going back to college. The protagonist thinks about it. H says that the problems at home and tuition are resolved, so he thinks it's a good time to return to his studies. At that moment, Yuri offers to pour more drinks, and he accepts. The girl also drinks and finds it a bit strong. Kei responds that 3 bottles of soju are no problem for him. Suddenly, another person enters the scene, greets Kei, and approaches the table. The guy comments that he hasn't seen the protagonist in a long time and asks how he's doing in the military service. Kang replies that he's been out for a while. The friend says he should have let him know. The protagonist explains that he thought he was busy looking for a job, so he preferred not to disturb him. Kang responds that he really was busy. Now he works in the financial sector, but is going through problems. The guy starts talking about how the commercial bank was doing well. But next year, the new hires at the investment bank will be fewer. Currently, they're thinking of creating a big investment bank. Many employees are complaining. The protagonist is shocked and asks if his friend isn't secure as a new hire. Kei replies that he's actually not. Even the new hires are being asked to resign voluntarily, so it's a tough decision. Singh asks worriedly what will happen if he does. Dismissed. Hung replies that he plans to invest in private capital. Then, living off this income is something he has always been interested in. The veteran next to him says he thought everything would be fine once Hung got the job, but that doesn't seem to be the case. After a few hours, the group has already drunk several bottles of alcohol, with Hung still complaining about his job, saying there are great entrepreneurs but no great investors in his country. The protagonist just observes as Hung says that maybe a brilliant investor will appear to save them from this disaster. At that moment, Yuri receives a call and confirms to his wife on the other end of the line that he is at the bar with the veteran. He asks who she is, and Yuri responds that it's Siona. Yuri says he told his friend that he would be drinking with the veterans, and she said she would come as well. The protagonist gives a frightened shout, asking why she invited Siona, and Yuri asks, confused, why he shouldn't have invited her. Suddenly, the bar's door opens, and a beautiful girl with gray hair enters. The protagonist looks at her irritated and recognizes her as Siona. The girl looks at him, surprised, as if she didn't expect to find him here. This was their first encounter since they ended their relationship. A few minutes later, the scene shifts to the two of them alone in a cafe. They preferred to move away from the group to avoid causing any discomfort. Siona mentions that it's been years and asks how he did in the army. The protagonist responds without much emotion that he did well. Then he asks how her relationship with Hyung is going. The girl quickly replies that it's fine. Kang and Siona had a relationship during university, but he went to the army, and the girl ended up breaking up because she fell in love with someone else at the time. Siona ended up dating the veteran who visited the university during the festival, and this guy is Jun Hyung, the third son of the owner of GH Company. Kang found out about the new relationship while still in the army, when Mi decided to tell him. The protagonist remembers feeling very sad because he liked the girl a lot. At this moment, he tells Siona that she has changed a lot. The girl agrees and, in the next moment, apologizes for breaking up when he was going through a tough time. Kang replies without emotion that it's all in the past now. Siona says sadly that she really liked him. Kang nearly chokes hearing this. The girl continues, saying that since she first saw him, she felt he was different from others. That's why she loved and trusted him 100%. The protagonist asks why she broke up then, if she had this feeling. In the scene, she reveals that she couldn't miss the opportunity. Kang asks if the opportunity was to date a rich guy. The girl says she won't try to defend herself because in the end, she was the one who broke up first. But she did it because she wanted to fulfill her dream. Kang asks what dream that was. The girl takes a deep breath and stands up to leave. The protagonist shouts for her to wait and tries to hold her. He asks what the dream is. She looks back and replies that it's success. The protagonist sits alone at a table, thinking about recent events. 2 years ago, his family lost their home before holding his father's funeral. Relatives turned their backs, and in the midst of it all, Siona decided to end the relationship. Kang felt everything was falling apart in his mind and he couldn't do anything. This was what motivated him to join the army. His mother had no support and had to take on hard jobs to survive. At this moment, the protagonist mentally thanks his friend Taik. After all, it was thanks to him that he won 1,000,000,000 won. He laughs, remembering. Your ex said about having success. It seems he knows well what that means. Suddenly, the eagle appears, and the protagonist, who's already out of his mind, offers her a drink, and then asks what she's going to show him this time. The boy then sees the prediction and raises his drink, saying that this is his future. At the end, Of the night, the protagonist broke into Taik's house and tried to wake him up. His friend from a distance smells the alcohol and asks Kang to go home and rest. The protagonist keeps pulling his arm and repeating the word success. The next day, Kang finally wakes up. He realizes he's at Taik's house and feels a strong headache. His friend, as always, is playing and tells the protagonist that he ordered a burger for his hangover. Kang asks if he's never heard of soup, then grabs the burger. Taik asks if something happened last night. The boy thinks for a moment and quickly remembers the eagle. He smiles and says he doesn't remember anything. His friend begins to shake his shoulders while asking if Kang has already decided about yesterday's plan. The protagonist decides to settle this matter quickly and asks if he's ever invested in his life. Taik replies that he hasn't. He's only withdrawn Bitcoin. It seems the protagonist doesn't know that much about investments either. In fact, he's tried investing a few times but failed in all of them and didn't get any returns. His friend then asks if he didn't study business. Kang says he only lasted a year and barely remembers what he learned. Taik says he currently has $1 million in his account, which equals 13 billion won. The protagonist knows that's an amount normal people will never see in their lives, so he feels lost about what to do with so much money. There's no shortage of capital to invest. Taik could easily live a quiet life with all the money he has now. The protagonist's worry is always the same: investing money and ending up losing it. But as we can see, his friend is eager to invest. Kang asks why he wants to invest the 13 billion won. Taik replies that the more, the better. The boy throws the burger wrapper behind him and says they could have fun doing it. The protagonist, being a much more cautious guy, says it's fun when you're making money. It stops being fun when you start losing. Anyway, the boy feels he's still not ready for this partnership. He remembers all the predictions he made earlier and wonders if he could really predict the future when it comes to financial matters. Just like Taik said, he concludes that he first needs more information. The protagonist spent the last few days checking large cap stocks listed on the stock exchange. Additionally, he sought to understand stock prices, oil prices, gold, and exchange rates. Much time was dedicated to not making any mistakes. Kang was lucky because currently the government requires banks to disclose important information. Thanks to this, it's now possible to see the good and bad news about the company. But of course, they won't release any information that could hurt their business that much. This means the information isn't of such high value. The protagonist concludes that he needs more privileged information, like the mountain ridge or the PEC. Taik advises being more patient. He also comments that it would be better to sign the contract. The protagonist is confused about what he's talking about. Taik says his sister always says that for any partnership, it's good to have a contract. Kang goes over to him and signs the contract, then says he's going to get a coffee. Taik replies there's no coffee at home. Suddenly, the protagonist's phone rings, and the number is unknown. The boy answers, and the person on the other side of the line identifies herself as Yuri. Kang repeats this name a few times and finally remembers the blonde girl at the bar. Yuri timidly asks if he is free and invites him for coffee. A few minutes later, the protagonist arrives at a nearby cafe. He enters, and Yuri quickly sets the scene. The girl thanks him for coming, even though she called him out of the blue. The protagonist responds that it's no problem because he was at a friend's house nearby. She feels a bit embarrassed and asks why the boy is looking at her like that. Kang replies that she looks a lot like a member of a female group he saw in the military. She asks if that girl was pretty. The protagonist gets a bit shy and decides to change the subject. He asks if she's from here. Yuri answers that she came from Shagidan. This information surprises the protagonist. He believes the girl is very rich. After all, it's hard to believe a freshman from Shkidan came to live here. Kang decides to understand why she called him here. Yuri responds that she actually wanted to apologize for what happened with Siona. The girl bows her head several times, saying she had never been to a meeting with upperclassmen and didn't know how to behave. The protagonist responds that she doesn't need to worry too much because it wasn't her fault. Yuri asks if he's planning to return next semester, and he replies yes. She says that if that happens, they'll be in the same class in the second year. At this moment, Yuri remembers something and says she has a favor to ask. Kang looks on with curiosity while the girl turns her face in embarrassment. This reaction sparks an idea in the protagonist. He quickly believes the girl plans to confess her feelings. The boy thinks for a moment about whether he should refuse, but he mentally says she's too beautiful to get a no. At this moment, Yuri breaks his expectations by asking him to go with her to change her phone. The girl explains the sudden request, saying she believes she will get scammed if she goes alone. The protagonist is incredulous and stammers in response. He almost planned their wedding and kids. Kang is embarrassed for imagining that the girl would confess her feelings. He quickly replies that he's not very good with electronics. Yuri responds that he doesn't need to try too hard and adds that she just needs his presence. The first thing the guy remembers is that Taik is the best companion for this situation. Taik knows all the latest releases and is always up to date on prices. The scene changes to the two of them entering an electronics store. Yuri tells the vendor that she's looking for a Seung Electronics L6. The attendant responds that this is the most popular model at the moment and asks them to follow him. Yuri talks with the vendor while the protagonist decides to take a look at the phones. He finds the model that Yuri is thinking of buying and remembers that he used the L3 before going to the military. But now the latest model is the L6. Time really flies. Suddenly, Kang is surprised by yet another vision. The message this time is that the L6 model will be discontinued. The protagonist looks intrigued when suddenly, the girl touches his arm. He gets scared and recoils. She asks what happened. Kang responds that it was a mosquito. The boy is happy that he finally received another prediction, and he finally buys the cell phone. They leave the store, and she says that she bought it on a contract and will have to take very good care of it. The protagonist looks at the device and accidentally lets slip that it will be discontinued soon. Yuri asks what he said, and Kang realizes he spoke his thoughts out loud and tries to reverse the situation by saying it was just a joke. After that, he starts running and waves to the girl, wishing her a good trip home. She tries to say something but is left alone. The protagonist breaks into Taik's house, and the guy asks why there's so much noise. Kang quickly summarizes what happened and even shows Sung's phone. Taik seems not to believe that his friend had a prediction that the L6 model would be discontinued just by touching the cell phone. Kang says he doesn't exactly know how this will happen because Seung Electronics launches a variety of smartphones, from economical to premium. Besides, the L series is Sung's best-selling line. But the protagonist also remembers that the smartphone market is currently dominated by NPL. So it's possible to say that the two brands are enemies. NPL launched a smartphone called N-Phone, and the sales and profit beat Seung's by a landslide victory. Kang said that this L6 was made with the intention of competing with the N-Phone. Taik finds this prediction strange because the L6 from Seung is going to hit the mark of 70 million units sold. Kang is also a bit reluctant to believe it and asks what could be the reason for it being discontinued. His friend suggests that it might be a patent dispute. Samsung Electronics is globally known and likely has many enemies in different countries. Some time ago, the patent dispute with NPL became known as the trial of the century. Kang begins to understand his friend's thought and says that usually the company that loses the patent dispute has to pay damages or licensing fees. This is the only reason they can find to justify stopping sales. But Taik wonders how it will get to that. He believes that there's no way Seung will lose, because the brand holds an enormous amount of communication and technology patents. In the last patent dispute with NPL, Seung countered using its communication patents and succeeded in that aspect. Thinking about all this, the boys conclude that they don't know anything. The protagonist's last suggestion is that there might be some issue with Seung's own product. Taik replies that it still doesn't make sense. When a device has a problem, the brand offers repairs or compensates the customer. It's strange to stop the production of something successful. The two friends talk for a while longer, pointing out the aspects they believe in, but nothing makes sense, and they prefer to sleep because they can't take the subject anymore. Suddenly, in the middle of the night, a scream is heard from Taik's apartment. The protagonist wakes up startled and asks what happened. His friend quickly replies that this thing exploded near his head. He says he was playing on the L6 when he got sleepy, then put the phone to charge and fell asleep. But out of nowhere, the device exploded. At that moment, the two approach the burnt phone. Taik asks what kind of phone explodes the first time it's charging. The protagonist responds that he doesn't know, but with certainty, if he knew, he would have warned. The two look at each other after this comment, when suddenly he notices a large bubble emerging from the phone. The next day, Ta reveals that he has already done some research, and there was an explosion accident before. 3 days after the launch, a photo was sent to the community. The client said that the device exploded while charging. Thanks to the quick response from Seung Electronics, the case was covered up, but even so, there were several similar reports on social networks. Taik believes the brand is trying to silence people with money. The protagonist asks what Seung said about the explosion. His friend responds that they tried to justify it, saying it was due to external impact, but in any case, the accidents weren't that common. There were minor problems besides the explosions, but that didn't really affect sales. He questions whether there was any problem in the manufacturing process. His friend responds that he believes not. In any case, They manage to get some information that might help them now. The protagonist agrees and says that in other predictions they didn't have to think much, just invested or took money from some account. But now, in this situation, it's necessary to know the timing of discontinuation and its effects to understand how. He then suggests observing the situation for a few more days. The next day, the boys received a visit from a Seong engineer. He said he would notify them about the causes of the explosion after an investigation. Then he tried to discuss with the boys about the compensation money. An important condition for receiving compensation is not to publish any information about the explosion online, at least until the investigation results are disclosed. The boys wait for the man to leave, and the protagonist says that the company doesn't seem surprised upon discovering that its phone exploded, judging by the reaction of its employee, of course. They've probably seen this case repeat itself many more times than was posted online. Besides, a device exploding can seriously injure a person. The protagonist believes that if this continues, it's reason enough for the L6 to be discontinued. Ta comments that Samsung Electronics' annual operating profit exceeds 30 trillion won, and from this operating profit, 40% comes from communication, which includes smartphones. The protagonist asks if they will lose 40% of the operating profit if the L6 is discontinued. Ta responds, not exactly, as Xiong has many previous models, but it will cause significant damage. His friend explains that if each phone costs 1 million won, then just the reimbursement value would be 6 trillion won. Considering the expected profits, the losses multiply several times. The protagonist understands his line of reasoning and says that the question now is how to invest. If the prediction was good, he would just buy the stock. But since it's bad, the option is limited. Ta asks if this isn't the kind of situation short selling is for. The protagonist responds that short selling itself is not difficult. It involves borrowing shares, selling them, and buying them back cheaper to make a profit. The issue is the profit margin. Even if you sell a stock worth 100 million won and buy it back for 10 million won, the profit margin will be low. Furthermore, the protagonist thinks that no stock will drop so much. The fall would be 20 to 30% at most. Investing 13 billion won to gain from 3 to 4 billion is a huge profit, but he believes he can still find a way to achieve greater profit. Tae then reminds the protagonist of college that he studied business administration, but the boy remembers nothing he learned there. He says he needs someone with more knowledge. The first person who comes to his mind is Rum. However, he wouldn't know how to explain to her why he needs information, not to mention he saw the future. Kik suggests the boy just explain that he trusts his vision. KK responds that he indeed underestimates his sister, but he's at ease because he knows someone. The friend asks who the person is. Kang responds that it's Park Sam-gyop, former president of the Real Investment Club. Some people call him a lunatic, and others call him a genius. In the world, there are two types of geniuses: those who are brilliant in multiple areas and those who excel in only one. Siam belongs to the latter group. He grew up in Australia, and as a child, his school grades were low. When he became an adult, he became interested in the stock market. One day he found a company called KMK Tech and predicted a tenfold increase in the stock price, so he quickly secured 5 million in stocks. After that, the company actually raised the stock price, and Sang received 50 million won. When the protagonist entered university, the professor had already amassed 300 million, but still felt it wasn't enough. He continued studying, and a stock caught his attention. It was in chemicals. He sold all his shares and began buying shares of the chemical products company, but this investment didn't go very well because the company simply went bankrupt, and he lost everything. Sang had to borrow from loan sharks, and when the time came to repay, he had to resort to some illegal practices. After that, the man simply disappeared off the map. The scene shifts to a restaurant. The protagonist tells Sang that it was very difficult to find him. The man scratches his head, embarrassed, and asks if Kang will pay for the meal. The protagonist replies that he will because the professor always paid for him when he needed it. Then, he introduces his friend to Sang. The man asks if Taik is the friend who bought Bitcoin in high school, and he quickly starts talking about how the boy could be rich if he had found the account key. King gives a sheepish smile and silently thanks his friend for finding that key. Then, he asks how the professor has been during this time. Sang replies that he is currently teaching math to college-bound students. He says that the low salary has made him realize how valuable even a single 101 coin is. The protagonist recalls that Sang went from making billions to being in debt overnight. It's a hard reality to face. The professor soon asks why the boy sought him out, to which Kang responds that he's trying to understand more about futures and options. Sang asks if he has gone through the process to open a futures and options account. The protagonist says no, but in fact, he has already set one up through Taik's company, Otech. Sang explains that futures and options have a difference and then asks if the two know what it is. Apparently, the boys only know the names. The professor decides to explain in detail. He says that futures are contracts where both parties agree and negotiate a specific amount of a commodity at a set price. The goal is to secure a fixed value, with no price increase or decrease. Whether you win or lose depends on the price on the contract date. Both parties are obligated to complete the payment despite profit or loss. Kang takes out his notebook and begins writing down everything he's hearing to avoid the risk of forgetting. The professor continues, saying that, on the other hand, in the case of options, you are selling a right to trade. The right to exercise the option belongs to the buyer. If the client doesn't want to buy, they will choose the next person. Taik then asks if in this case the seller has the advantage. Sang responds that, in the market, the win rate is higher for the option seller. Taik asks if the seller always wins. The professor answers this question with an example, and then explains that the higher probability will always be on the seller's side.